Doctors said it was the worst shark attack they had ever seen. This is Rodney Fox, and he was just 22 years old at the time, and he was also a champion at spearfishing. In 1963, Rodney was attempting to regain his title one more time, and they were having a competition at Aldinga Beach in Adelaide. So a few hours after the competition started, he decided that he needed to go further away from shore in order to catch a rare type of fish that would get him more points. So he spots the fish that he wants to catch, and he's about to pull the trigger on his spear gun when out of nowhere, he said something hit him directly on the side, but he had no idea what it was. Whatever it was, it had enough force to knock his spear gun and his face mask right off, and then he said that he was basically being carried through the water faster than he had ever swam in his life. Initially, he thought it must have been a submarine, but then he quickly realized that it was a great white shark. Fortunately, Rodney remembered that a vulnerable place for sharks are their eyes, so he started gouging them out, and thankfully the shark did let him go. As the shark opened its mouth to let Rodney go, he tried to push himself off the shark in order to get further away from him, but in doing that, he accidentally rubbed his hand along the shark's teeth, which essentially ended up ripping his arm open. Somehow, he then managed to get under the shark and wrapped his entire body around the belly of the shark, kind of like a bear hug, because he knew the shark would not be able to get him from there. But of course, Rodney realized that he wasn't going to be able to hold his breath forever, so he knew that he had to kick the shark away and get to the top as fast as he could. So Rodney gets to the top of the water, and immediately he sees that he's engulfed in blood. Right after that, all he sees are hundreds of teeth coming straight towards him. All he could do at that point was try to swim away as much as he could, and thankfully it worked because the shark missed and ended up biting a floating device that was right next to Rodney. Unfortunately, this floating device was still connected to Rodney's diving belt, and it just ended up pulling him right back underwater. Fortunately, because of all the thrashing around the shark was doing, it ended up ripping the line, and Rodney was able to swim back to the surface. And that's where there was a boat waiting for him because they had seen all of the red blood in the water from the beach. And when Rodney got to the hospital, doctors said it was indeed the worst shark attack they had ever seen. In total, Rodney had to get 462 stitches around his body, including 29 stitches inside of his lungs. And there are way more graphic photos of his injuries online, but I cannot show them to you on here. But essentially, if you couldn't already tell from the photo, his entire torso had been ripped open and his organs were exposed. And just a year and a half after the shark attack, Rodney would go back and compete in the same competition. Today, Rodney is still alive and he's 81 years old, and every day he has a small reminder that he is very lucky to be alive. This has to be the worst shark attack in US history, and I'm talking about the USS Indianapolis. Now, this story takes us to July 28, 1945, during the Second World War. The USS Indianapolis was sailing on its own from Guam to meet the USS Idaho towards the Philippines. That's where both of the ships were going to prepare for an invasion into Japan. It was July 1945 and everything was going well up until midnight, when out of nowhere a Japanese torpedo hit the USS Indianapolis head on. Shortly after that, a second torpedo ended up hitting the ship as well, and this was said to have caused a chain reaction of small explosions, which caused one big explosion and ended up ripping the ship in two. It only took about 12 minutes for the entire ship to sink, and there were over 1,100 men on board. By the time the ship was underwater, it was estimated that about 900 of the men survived the initial attack and were left floating in the middle of the ocean. By the next morning, the men had gathered as many of the lifeboats and life jackets as they could to stay alive. However, they didn't realize that they were basically sitting in the middle of shark-infested waters. Slowly, one by one, the men started being picked off by white-tipped sharks. It was said that the sharks started consuming the men that had already passed away, but when they were finished with that, they started going after the ones that were still alive. Unfortunately, because so many of the men were injured and bleeding out, it just ended up attracting more and more sharks towards them. Even though the men tried to gather in groups for safety, it wasn't much help because the sharks would still go towards the men that were bleeding out and literally just pick them off and pull them into the water. Whenever one of the men would pass away from exposure or thirst, the rest of the men would push his body off into the water in hopes that it would distract the sharks. Some of the men were able to gather some food supplies, and one of them had made the mistake of opening a can of Spam in the middle of the ocean, which actually ended up attracting a huge swarm of sharks. After that, they were forced to basically throw away a big portion of their food. As the days went by, many of the men ended up starving or hallucinating or passing away because they had drank salt water. It wasn't until the fourth day lost at sea that a Navy plane ended up flying over and spotted the group of men floating in the water. By the time they rescued all of the men in the water, there was only 317 of them left, and it's estimated that 150 of the men were victims of shark attacks. And to this day, it remains one of the worst shark attacks in US history. This is one of Australia's most infamous shark attacks. This is Shirley Durden, and this story takes us back to March 3rd, 1985 in South Australia. Shirley and her family had recently moved to the coast because her husband had a lot of allergies when they were living inland in more of a rural part of Australia. On March 3rd, the family decided to go on a family outing towards Peak Bay, where Shirley was going diving for scallops. So Shirley is in the water approximately 150 yards away from the shoreline while her husband and her kids were playing in the sand. Then out of nowhere they hear these piercing screams, and eyewitnesses reported seeing a great white shark estimated to be about 20 feet long tearing up Shirley. It was apparently a very bloody and gruesome scene, and witnesses remember her husband yelling over and over, "She's gone, she's gone." By the time rescuers got to Shirley, all that was left of her was a headless torso. As the rescuers' boat was getting close enough to retrieve her torso, the shark suddenly came back and ended up taking that with it as well. This is Paul Templar, and he survived the impossible. This story takes us to the Zambezi River, which is located in Zimbabwe in Africa. Paul is also a native to Zimbabwe, so he was super familiar with the area. And during this time, he was a wildlife expert that would take people on canoe safaris. This area is also known to have quite a lot of hippos. Except there was one particular hippo that was showing a lot of aggression 6 months before the event. And this particular hippo even tried to attack Paul a few months before the incident happened. Thankfully, that particular time he was able to get away. So March of 1996 comes around, and Paul and another colleague of his are taking a group of people on one of these canoe safaris. Everything was going fine up until they got to a certain portion where they saw a bunch of hippos. That's when one of the hippos started charging towards them and knocked one of the canoes over, which resulted in Paul's colleague falling into the water. So Paul instructs the rest of the people to go towards shore while he goes and saves his friend. He jumps into the water, but that's when he sees something coming straight towards them. He described it as being kind of like an underwater bullet with the water rippling up above. Right away, he knew that it was the aggressive hippo that had been causing a lot of trouble. And just as he was about to reach his friend's hand, he said everything went completely black. Immediately, he noticed that from the torso up, he wasn't underwater. He was still a little bit damp, but it was off. So he starts moving his hands around trying to figure out where he is, and that's when he's able to touch the hippo's snout and realize that he's inside the hippo's mouth. Essentially, he had been swallowed by the hippo. And while he was in there, he described the hippo's breath as resembling rotten eggs. Paul did his best to wiggle himself around in order to get the hippo to spit him back out, but the problem is that one of the hippo's tusks had impaled him. So all he could do was hold on for dear life in hopes that the tusk wouldn't tear right through his entire body. Eventually the hippo did spit him out, but just started thrashing him around in the water before swallowing him a second time. Paul went on to say that the hippo was basically playing around with him like a ball. He would throw him in the air and then catch him again. And the people that were waiting on shore said that it looked like a dog trying to rip apart a rag doll. Eventually, the hippo became extremely frustrated because Paul's body wasn't ripping into tiny pieces. So eventually he let him go, and that's when one of his friends was able to paddle over towards him and rescue him. When Paul was rescued, they realized that his arm was completely crushed and his body had a bunch of puncture wounds. It was a miracle that he survived, but he did have to have his arm amputated. Fight your enemy or go into a crocodile-infested swamp? Well, that's exactly what these Japanese soldiers had to decide between during World War II. So this story takes us to Ramree Island during early 1945 during the Second World War. Basically, both the British troops and the Japanese troops were fighting over land, specifically Ramree Island, because they needed more space to launch attack. So for the next 6 weeks, they basically fought each other to see whoever would win. Towards the end of the 6 weeks, the British troops were able to isolate approximately 1,000 Japanese soldiers, letting them know that they've captured most of them and that they should probably just surrender. However, the Japanese troops were not going to surrender. They weren't going to just take this lying down. The Japanese thought that their best bet would be to travel through this 8-mile swamp that was infested with crocodiles instead of actually surrender. And the reason they wanted to cross this way was because they would reach a larger group of Japanese soldiers. The British, though, on the other hand, they knew exactly what was waiting for the Japanese soldiers, so they didn't even bother going after them. They all knew that saltwater crocodiles were waiting for all of these soldiers and that they basically had no chance against them because they can grow up to be 17 feet long and over 1,000 pounds. So the Japanese soldiers decide to go into this swamp and slowly, one by one, they start falling to the crocodile. A few of the British soldiers that stayed behind to watch said that it was basically like watching a massacre happen. The crocodiles were going absolutely crazy with the smell and taste of blood everywhere, and whatever the crocodiles hadn't eaten the night before, the vultures then came in the morning to finish off. It's estimated that out of the 1,000 Japanese soldiers that went into the swamp, approximately 480 of them survived. However, this number is heavily debated because British soldiers said that they were only able to capture 20 of them as they exited the swamp. However, the exact number remains unknown to this day. This story is literally why you shouldn't make abrupt decisions in the heat of the moment. So this story takes us to Battling Wildlife Park in China in the summer of 2016. It's basically like a zoo and a safari all mixed in one, where people are able to take tours or even drive their cars throughout the entire enclosure. This allows people to get very close to the animals, including tigers and lions. Obviously, as you're making your way through the entire tour, you're not supposed to get out of your car or even roll down your window. Although it is a controlled environment, these are still wild animals and anything could happen at any moment. Unfortunately, one particular lady did not quite listen. So a family was taking the tour one day during the summer of 2016 when they got into an argument inside of their car. Inside the car was a young couple with their young son as well as the woman's mother. It's not known exactly what they were fighting about. All we know is that there was an argument and it got so bad that the wife ended up getting out of the car. So in the top photo here, you can see her getting out of the car on the opposite side of the driver. Then in the middle photo here, she actually goes around the car to the opposite side where the driver is and opens the backseat door. Then in the bottom photo, you can kind of see her just standing there. It's not known exactly what she was doing. In a matter of seconds, a huge Siberian tiger runs up from behind her, pounces on her, and then drags her away. Everyone in the car witnesses what happens, and she's kicking and screaming, trying to fight off this huge tiger. These animals are not anything to play around with. So this woman is fighting for her life, so her husband and her mother get out of the car and try to help her. Somehow she was able to get away from the tiger, but unfortunately when that happened, the tiger then attacked her mother. Unfortunately, her mother would go on to pass away. And although the woman was mauled pretty badly, she would go on to make a full recovery at the hospital, and her husband and her son were unharmed. And the following year, she would go on to sue the park for 330,000 US dollars. The final amount that they settled on was not fully disclosed. This is probably one of the strangest animal attacks I've ever heard of, and today we're going to talk about rattlesnakes. In the photo here is Milo Sutcliffe and his wife Jennifer. It was May 2018, right before Memorial Day weekend, when the couple was outside their home in Corpus Christi, Texas, while they were gardening. As Jennifer was doing her gardening, she noticed something strange coming towards her. Immediately, she recognized that it was a snake, but it wasn't just any ordinary snake. It was a rattlesnake. These are known to be very dangerous and quite venomous. So she ends up screaming for Milo, and he hears her and runs towards her with a shovel. He then proceeds to use his shovel to decapitate the snake, thinking that he had taken care of the situation. He then goes to pick up the snake's head to throw it in the trash, when suddenly the snake ends up biting onto his hand. Of course, Milo and his wife were extremely shocked. They had absolutely no idea what was going on or how this was even possible. Theory is that snakes and similar creatures don't need as much oxygen to live. So by decapitating it, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to kill the creature. It's been documented in the past that snakes who have been decapitated are able to live from minutes to even hours long. And when Milo bent down to pick up the snake's head, the snake was likely still aware that it was in danger, so all it did was try to defend itself. However, because it wasn't operating at full capacity, it ended up injecting a lot more venom than it would normally into Milo's hand. This caused Milo to end up being rushed to the hospital right away, where he was put into a coma by the doctors. His kidneys were failing, and he was forced to stay in the coma for 5 days until he was able to stabilize. And there are pictures of his injury online if you have the stomach for it. But thankfully, he would go on to fully recover. This woman's dogs saved her life and once again proved why dogs are man's best friend. So the woman in this photo is named Alina Hansens. It was 2008 and Alina was living in Caliente, California at her mountaintop ranch. She was out on her property with her two dogs when she came across a bear. Initially, she noticed that the bear wasn't full grown, so she thought it must have been pretty young and estimated it weighed about 150 pounds. And when she spotted it, it was only about 10 feet away from her. And before she knew it, this bear had jumped on her and started attacking her. It went right for her head and her face and literally just started chewing. Alina recalled hearing the sound of the bear's teeth grinding up against her bone and even remembers when it punctured her eyeball. She suffered horrific damages, and there's much more graphic photos online if you have the stomach for it. But she was awake during the entire attack and even remembers seeing the bear spit out several of her teeth. It took every ounce of energy that she had left, but she started screaming out for her dogs, Decoy and Arky. And they were pretty big dogs too. They would definitely put up a fight, and of course, because the dogs loved Alina, they came straight to her. They started barking and doing whatever they could to fight off the bear and basically almost sacrificed themselves. Thankfully, both of the dogs survived the attack. With her two dogs having scared off the bear, Alina was now free to go look for help. But because her ranch was in a somewhat isolated area, she had to hike 10 minutes to get to her car. But then she has to drive 4 miles to the closest fire station, and when she finally gets there, the firefighters were absolutely horrified to see the state that she was in. Of course, they called for help and she was flown to the nearest hospital where doctors spent the next 10 hours trying to put her face back together. But surprisingly for Alina, the worst part wasn't the bear attack, it was actually dealing with her insurance to get them to pay for the surgeries she needed. Her insurance only wanted to pay for the surgeries that were necessary for her to survive, which basically only were enough to leave her fully disfigured, so she needed to pay out of pocket for any reconstructive and cosmetic surgeries. After appearing on several news stations, many doctors saw her story and offered their services for free. However, for the remaining surgeries, Alina still had to pay, and it's estimated that she's spent over $250,000 of her own money, including her retirement plan. Although she has recovered for the most part, she still struggles with a few things like her sinuses and her eyesight. But she is quite thankful to still be alive. And as for her two dogs, Decoy and Arky, although they survived the initial attack, eventually they would go on to pass away due to old age. If the locals are telling you to not go swimming in the water, you should probably listen. Unfortunately, that's exactly what Ginger Meadows didn't do. It was 1987 and Ginger Meadows had just watched the latest Crocodile Dundee movie, which had inspired her to visit Australia. So she goes off to Australia with one of her friends and they go on a boat tour. They went to this area here known as Cascade Falls, located just south of Darwin. The skipper on that boat that day had warned absolutely everyone to not get in the water because it was infested with crocodiles. These things are absolutely huge. So even though they had been warned not to go into the water, Ginger and her friend didn't listen and they decided to go for a swim anyways. As the girls were swimming, the skipper of the boat noticed that there was a crocodile going straight for the women. Of course, he's yelling at them, telling them that they need to get out of the water right away, but it was way too late. The two women were way too far away from the boat to get back in, so all they could do was swim towards the wall of the waterfall. That's where they were basically both pinned up against the wall with nowhere else to go and the crocodile coming straight towards them. Crocodile then swam right towards them and opened up its huge mouth, and that's when Ginger's friend Jane decided to take off her shoe and throw it at the crocodile. This then kind of spooked the crocodile and forced it to close its mouth and go underwater. I guess at this point Ginger was either super confused, afraid, or just on survival mode because as soon as the crocodile went underwater, Ginger stood up and chose to jump back into the water in an attempt to swim back to the boat. Unfortunately, Ginger was only able to take 2 or 3 strokes before the crocodile grabbed her by the waist. The crocodile then dove underwater with Ginger in its mouth and stayed there for a few seconds before jumping back out with Ginger in its mouth and her screaming for help. Her friend recalled Ginger staring directly at her, not knowing what else to do. All she could really do was watch in horror as this animal was eating her friend alive. Sadly, there was no hope for Ginger, and her body was finally retrieved from the water the next day, which would have been her 25th birthday. This animal attack story was one of those stories that haunted me for years. I could absolutely not imagine being on the other end of the phone call this woman received. So in this photo is Olga Moskalyova and her stepfather Igor. Olga was just 19 at the time. They both loved the outdoors, and on this particular day they had both gone camping in a very remote area of Russia. You can see on this red map here where the red dot is, that's where they were camping. Olga's stepfather Igor was by a river near some tall grass, and when he wasn't paying attention, he was attacked by a bear. The attack on Igor was said to have been extremely violent. The bear, being the size that it was able to easily overpower him, and it ended up breaking Igor's neck and smashing his skull. Then the bear turned its attention to Olga. It started chasing her, but she started running away. She was able to run approximately 70 yards before the bear caught up to her and grabbed her by the leg, then pinned her down and literally just started eating her alive. Not knowing what else to do, Olga, in her final moments, decided to call her mother. She told her mother what was happening, but also told her to call for help. At first, her mother thought she was joking and it was some sort of prank call. But then her mother heard in the background the noises of something chomping down and chewing. Then she heard the growling of the bear. So, of course, at this point, she realized that her daughter was not lying to her and that she was indeed being eaten alive. Olga just kept screaming, "Mom, please help me, the bear is eating me." Olga's mother gets off the phone and then calls the authorities, but she also calls a bunch of relatives that lived in the area nearby. However, they wouldn't get there for at least the next 30 minutes. Olga calls her mother back again. This time, Olga tells her mother that the bear had left her alone but had returned, and this time it came back with her babies. All of the animals at this point were eating Olga bit by bit. Some miracle, Olga was able to stay alive throughout this entire ordeal. Olga then calls her mother one last time, and on this phone call she told her mother that she felt like she was finally going to pass. Then she tells her mother that she's no longer hurting and doesn't feel any more pain. And she asks her mother to forgive her for everything and that she loves her very much. Then the call cuts off and we can all assume that Olga passed away at that point. About half hour later, Igor's brother arrives and discovers a very gruesome scene. The bear at this point was still devouring Igor's body. Olga was left alone at this point, but she was clearly unalive. After the attack, hunters were sent in to look for the mother and her cub. It's not known if they were ever found. I still don't know what to think about this one. This is Terry Garner, and he was 69 years old at the time, living on a farm in Oregon. He was said to have loved animals, especially pigs, and on his farm he was known to have pigs that grew to be 700 pounds. And unfortunately, sometimes these pigs are known to become aggressive. Then one day, on October 2012, everything changed. Terry had gone out to feed his pigs just like a regular day when he disappeared. After several hours of not being able to locate him, his family reported him as missing. Soon after that, his dentures and parts of his bodies were discovered in the pig's den. Initially, it was believed that Terry suffered a heart attack and then collapsed and fell into the pig's pen. That's where his lifeless body lay, basically a waiting meal for all of the pigs. And in very rare cases, pigs have been known to devour human flesh. But because of this, police wanted to investigate every possibility, including the idea that his pigs could have potentially purposely knocked Terry over in order to eat him. In the months leading up to Terry's passing, one of his pigs had been known to be aggressive and even tried to bite him once. Terry was going to put this pig down, but later changed his mind. But unfortunately, by the time his body was discovered, the pigs had consumed so much of him that they were unable to determine exactly what happened. So to this day, the passing of Terry remains a mystery. In the summer of 1916, chaos broke out on the Jersey Shore. There were 4 fatal shark attacks within a 2-week period, alongside several more shark attacks. This is what happened. The first victim was a man named Charles Van Sant, and he was from Philadelphia. He was swimming right off the beach shore with his dog, having the time of his life on July 1st of 1916. Suddenly, he was attacked by a shark, having both of his legs completely mangled. A nearby lifeguard was able to get to him and bring him back to shore, but unfortunately, he ended up bleeding out and passing away. After this first incident, local police tried to play this down to make people not worry. The next attack took place on July 6th, and this time it was a man named Charles Bruder from Switzerland. Everyone was swimming in the ocean, just enjoying their day, when suddenly a woman heard some very loud screams. She turned and saw Charles completely surrounded by bloody water, and unfortunately he ended up passing away as well. But this time, this accident made national headlines. It was all over the newspapers. 2 days later, by July 8th, Coast Guards were patrolling the entire Jersey Shore armed with weapons. And most of the beaches ended up closing down because everyone was just way too afraid to go into the water. Then on July 12th, there were 3 more shark attacks on Matawan Creek. The first victim was 11-year-old Lester Stillwell, who was swimming in a nearby creek with a group of his friends. Shortly after that, Walton Stanley Fisher was the next victim, and apparently over 100 people witnessed him being attacked and passing away within the water. And sadly, he had passed away trying to retrieve the body of Lester. About an hour later, 12-year-old Joseph Dunn was attacked in a different part of the creek. Fortunately, he ended up surviving because his friends were brave enough to help him out of the water. 2 days later, local fishermen ended up catching a shark in the area, and when they opened up its belly, they discovered over 15 pounds of human flesh. And throughout this 2 week period, and even throughout the rest of the summer, there was a lot of hysteria going on. There were even bounties placed for whoever could capture these sharks, with many local fishermen taking on this challenge and hunting down hundreds of sharks. And later on, the 1916 Jersey Shore shark attacks would go on to inspire the first Jaws movie. It's an absolute miracle this guy is still alive. This guy is Matthew Dyer, and in the summer of 2013, his life completely changed. He was living in Maine at the time, and he was also an avid outdoorsman. And so when he heard about a 2 week expedition that was taking place in Newfoundland, Canada, he knew he had to go. It was going to be a group of people that were essentially going hiking and camping in a rural part of Newfoundland. So Matt and a group of 6 other explorers decided to go on this trip together. After several plane rides, the group finally arrived at base camp, and that's where they set up their tents. This is where the group sat and discussed what they were going to do for the next several days, including all of their hiking plans and emergency plans. Finally, the group boarded a final flight that was set for the Torngat Mountains, which was actually their final destination. And this part of Canada is extremely remote. Essentially, there are no roads, facilities, or Wi-Fi, and it's very cold there. So basically, you have to be a very experienced outdoors person to survive here. They then arrived to their next campsite where they set up all of their tents. And because they knew there were a lot of dangerous animals around, they also set up an electrical fence around all of the tents for added security. And over the next few days, the entire excursion was going to plan and everyone was having a great time. On July 23rd, Matthew had decided to go to bed early because he was tired. He was fast asleep in his tent when he woke up in the middle of the night. He wasn't sure what was going on, but he could hear some strange noises outside. Then out of nowhere came a huge shadow that basically engulfed the entire tent. Then before he knew it, whatever this thing was ripping its way into his tent. That's when he came face to face with a giant polar bear. The polar bear then grabbed Matthew with both of its arms and clamped down on his head with its mouth. It then dragged Matthew out of his tent across the ground. And all Matthew could remember at that point was that he heard his jaw and his skull cracking. The polar bear then kept dragging Matthew across the beach towards the water. And of course, this entire time, Matthew was in extreme pain, which caused him to scream and wake up the rest of the camp members. All of the members started to make noise with anything they could in order to try to scare the bear. But by this point, Matthew had been dragged so far for the bear that he thought he was going to pass away. Rick Gross then fired his flare gun, which ended up striking the bear right in the face. This ended up scaring the bear quite a lot, which caused him to rattle Matthew in its mouth before slamming him back onto the ground. This ended up breaking Matthew's neck, but the bear did let him go and walk the other way. All Matthew could do at this point was basically repeat in his head over and over again, "Please, bear, go away." Thankfully it worked, but Matthew ended up suffering extensive damages. And little did they know at the time, but the group had actually selected an area known as Polar Bear Highway. Essentially, this area was infested with polar bears, but thankfully Matthew would go on to recover. On October 15, 2022, these 2 young men survived one of the worst bear attacks I've ever heard of. On the left is Brady Lowry, and on the right is his friend Kendall Cummings. Both of the men were in their early 20s, and they were actually both wrestlers on the same team. The 2 guys were heading up to Shoshone National Park along with 2 additional friends. All 4 of them were heading on a day of shed hunting, which is essentially when you look for old antlers on the ground. The group of friends had initially split up. Brady and Kendall went on their own, while the other 2 went in a different direction. Brady was looking on the ground when he discovered a very big pile of fresh bear poop. That's when he yelled over to Kendall, making a joke about what he had just discovered, when suddenly they heard a very large noise in the back. Out of nowhere came a full-grown female grizzly bear attacking Brady head-on. Immediately, she attacked his head and facial area and then started throwing him around like a rag doll. And almost right away, Brady recalls hearing his arm snap in multiple places, realizing that he barely stood a chance against this bear. Obviously, Kendall heard Brady's screams and turns around, and to his horror, he sees the bear literally completely dominating his friend. He tries screaming at the bear, throwing branches and even rocks that were a direct hit, but it did literally nothing to the bear. And that's when Kendall's wrestling instincts kicked in and he decided to run full force at the bear and jump on it from behind. He was able to essentially wrestle the bear, hold on to it, and was able to pull its head from the back. This was enough to get the bear's attention away from Brady, but unfortunately, the bear then hyper focused on Kendall. Brady was able to roll himself over, but when he looked over at Kendall, he saw that the bear was now going towards him. But Kendall was still very confused, and all he knew is that he was drenched in blood. Kendall then starts running away from the bear with a few seconds of a head start, but it was no use. The bear was way too fast. The bear had gotten a hold of Kendall and essentially was doing the same thing that it had done to Brady. By some miracle, Brady was able to gather the strength and climb up a hill in order to call 911. At the same time, he was also able to wave down his friends who spotted him because he was wearing a bright red shirt. His friends rush over to him and they were not able to make out exactly what he was saying until he muttered the word bear. His friends were also completely mortified because Brady had no idea the extent of his injuries. A few minutes later, Kendall re-emerges to the hill and he is also covered in blood. There's pictures of this online if you have the stomach for it. But essentially, a part of his face had been ripped off and he had puncture wounds all over his body. The two friends were immediately taken to the hospital in Billings, Montana. And even though they both had extensive injuries like broken bones and deep lacerations, they would go on to make a full recovery. And of course, they're both looking forward to going back into the woods. This is why you should never mess with lions. But I feel like I really don't need to tell you guys that anyway, so here's what happened. In 1991, there was a man named Daniel Abu Doran living in Nigeria who believed he was a prophet. So Daniel had been inspired by a biblical story of Daniel and the lion's den. The biblical story goes that Daniel was thrown into the lion's den, and essentially he was just awaiting meal for them. But instead of attacking him, the lions didn't do anything to Daniel. It's said that an angel was sent down from the heavens and shut all of the lions' mouths so they wouldn't attack Daniel. And so this Daniel wanted to recreate his own version of those events. So on that particular day, he made his way to the zoological garden at the University of Ibadan. And once he got there, it said that he spoke to a lot of the zoo workers in order to convince them to let him into the lion's den. Obviously, the zookeepers were telling him absolutely no way. And one version of the story goes that Daniel decided not to listen to the warnings of the zookeepers and just snuck in himself. While other versions of the story say that he was able to successfully convince the zookeepers to let him in. So Daniel the prophet enters the lion's den with his long red robe and his Bible in hand. And of course, there were plenty of people at the zoo that day watching what was going to happen next. So Daniel enters and immediately starts reciting the Bible. And to everyone's surprise, the lions started retreating. And because the lions started retreating, this gave Daniel the confidence to approach them even. But the second he decided to get a little bit too close to the lions, they pounced on him. Immediately, the lions started devouring him, ripping apart his red robe for all of the spectators to see. And by the end of it, the only things that remained were parts of Daniel's robe and his Bible. And followers of Daniel the prophet actually went on to say that they believed the lions were possessed by demonic spirits. And if you guys want more crime, creepy, and unbelievable stories, check out my YouTube for longer videos. The link is in my bio. This story has to be one of the worst bear attacks I've ever heard of. The guy in the middle is named Jeremy Evans, and in the summer of 2017, his life completely changed. Now this story takes us to the Canadian Rockies in Alberta, and that's where Jeremy was actually going on a solo hunting trip in August of 2017. So as he was hunting, he was looking through his binoculars and looking at the birds in the sky. That's when he noticed something coming directly towards him at his feet. And when he took a closer look at it, he noticed that it was a little baby bear. Immediately, Jeremy knew that this was not a good thing. Wherever there was a baby bear, the mother bear would be nearby. And that's exactly what happened. Before Jeremy could turn around or even really do anything to get away from the area, the mother bear started attacking him. He said that the bear attacked him from behind and immediately pinned him onto the ground. In an attempt to defend himself, he took his backpack and tried smashing it over the bear's head, but it didn't do anything to it. And the first thing the bear did was bite down on his head. Immediately, Jeremy knew that the bear was essentially ripping into his face and to his scalp. He was able to feel the bear's canine teeth puncturing his eye and his jaw ripping his face apart. And as he was trying to defend himself, obviously his hands got in the way and they were essentially mangled. He also tried to fight back with the bear, poking its eyes and even trying to choke it, but it was no use. He then, for a second, managed to get away and tried to grab his shotgun and reload it, but because his hands were so mangled, he just couldn't get it to work. And at one point, Jeremy said that he recalled seeing pieces of his face hanging down in front of him. He even managed to find a piece of his ear, and he recalled seeing his eyeball hanging. And basically, in order to survive, he had to hold pieces of his face in his hands and push them back up towards his face. Eventually, after the bear was satisfied with the attack, it left Jeremy alone. But Jeremy was now horribly injured in the middle of nowhere and had to find a way to get help. And by some miracle, he started hiking his way back to camp. But of course, because of the extent of his injuries, he couldn't really see where he was going, and he ended up falling several times. And at one point, he just laid there and had basically given up and pulled out his phone. And all he could do was play the song Baby Shark because it reminded him of his baby that he recently had. And that ended up giving him the courage to continue, and it would take him 8 hours to finally find help. Miraculously, he stumbled upon a cabin where they called 911 and rushed him to the Calgary hospital. He had to undergo major reconstructive surgery. And if you have the stomach for it, there's a photo that he took of himself after the attack, and it's extremely disturbing. And just 48 hours after he was released from the hospital, he decided to go hunting again. In Cabo, local fishermen will tell you that sharks are not what you should be afraid of. What actually scares them is this thing, and it's known as the Humboldt squid. And these guys are known for being extremely predatory animals. And in 2016, Scott Castleman experienced firsthand what these squids could do. And he even caught the entire thing on tape. So Scott is an experienced diver, and in 2016, he was diving off the coast of Baja Sur in Mexico, where he was filming a video for Animal Planet. As he was filming underwater, he started to notice shadows around the corner of his eyes, kind of circling him. And that's when he noticed that there were now multiple squids surrounding him. Knowing the dangers around these creatures, Scott immediately tried to ascend into the water. But because these creatures are extremely predatory, they caught onto this and immediately began their vicious attack on Scott. In screenshots of the video, you can see that the squids were grabbing onto anything, including his camera equipment. But that's not it. They basically started tackling him and ended up dislocating his shoulder. One of the squid then wrapped around him and started dragging him underneath the water extremely fast. And because he didn't have any time to adjust to the depths of the water, his eardrums ended up exploding because he was just going down way too fast. Miraculously, Scott was able to break free and started going towards the top of the water. But the squids were not ready to let him go. After all, they wanted to make a meal out of him. And so the squids started chasing back after him, attacking him and throwing themselves onto him. And one of them launched themselves directly at Scott's wrist, which ended up breaking it. And in the video, you can hear Scott screaming for his life. Needless to say, it was extremely painful. Miraculously, Scott was able to free himself and then swam back up to the surface of the water, but this time he only had one hand to use. Once he reached the surface, he started banging on the side of the boat. And that's when the fishermen were able to help him back on. And thankfully, he did go on to make a full recovery. And if you're curious, the video of the entire attack is on YouTube. Just search Scott Castle Squid Attack. And if you guys want more crime, creepy, and unbelievable stories, check out my YouTube for more. The link is in my bio. In Cabo, local fishermen will tell you that sharks are not what you should be afraid of. What actually scares them is this thing, and it's known as the Humboldt squid. And these guys are known for being extremely predatory animals. And in 2016, Scott Castleman experienced firsthand what these squids could do. and he even caught the entire thing on tape. So Scott is an experienced diver, and in 2016, he was diving off the coast of Baja Sur in Mexico, where he was filming a video for Animal Planet. As he was filming underwater, he started to notice shadows around the corner of his eyes, kind of circling him. And that's when he noticed that there were now multiple squids surrounding him. Knowing the dangers around these creatures, Scott immediately tried to ascend and get out of the water. But because these creatures are extremely predatory, they caught onto this and immediately began their vicious attack on Scott. In screenshots of the video, you can see that the squids were grabbing onto anything, including his camera equipment. But that's not it. They basically started tackling him and ended up dislocating his shoulder. One of the squid then wrapped around him and started dragging him underneath the water extremely fast. And because he didn't have any time to adjust to the depths of the water, his eardrums ended up exploding because he was just going down way too fast. Miraculously, Scott was able to break free and started going towards the top of the water. But the squids were not ready to let him go. After all, they wanted to make a meal out of him. And so the squids started chasing back after him, attacking him and throwing themselves onto him. And one of them launched themselves directly at Scott's wrist, which ended up breaking it. And in the video, you can hear Scott screaming for his life. Needless to say, it was extremely painful. Miraculously, Scott was able to free himself and then swam back up to the surface of the water, but this time he only had one hand to use. Once he reached the surface, he started banging on the side of the boat, and that's when the fishermen were able to help him back on. And thankfully, he did go on to make a full recovery. And if you're curious, the video of the entire attack is on YouTube. Just search Scott Castle Squid Attack. And if you guys want more crime, creepy, and unbelievable stories, check out my YouTube for more. The link is in my bio. In Cabo, local fishermen will tell you that sharks are not what you should be afraid of. What actually scares them is this thing, and it's known as the Humboldt squid. And these guys are known for being extremely predatory animals. And in 2016, Scott Castleman experienced firsthand what these squids could do. And he even caught the entire thing on tape. So Scott is an experienced diver, and in 2016, he was diving off the coast of Baja Sur in Mexico, where he was filming a video for Animal Planet. As he was filming underwater, he started to notice shadows around the corner of his eyes, kind of circling him. And that's when he noticed that there were now multiple squids surrounding him. Knowing the dangers around these creatures, Scott immediately tried to ascend and get out of the water. But because these creatures are extremely predatory, they caught onto this and immediately began their vicious attack on Scott. In screenshots of the video, you can see that the squids were grabbing onto anything, including his camera equipment. But that's not it. They basically started tackling him and ended up dislocating his shoulder. One of the squid then wrapped around him and started dragging him underneath the water extremely fast. And because he didn't have any time to adjust to the depths of the water, his eardrums ended up exploding because he was just going down way too fast. Miraculously, Scott was able to break free and started going towards the top of the water. But the squids were not ready to let him go. After all, they wanted to make a meal out of him. For his life. Needless to say, it was extremely painful. Miraculously, Scott was able to free himself and then swam back up to the surface of the water, but this time he only had one hand to use. Once he reached the surface, he started banging on the side of the boat, and that's when the fishermen were able to help him back on. And thankfully, he did go on to recovery. And if you're curious, the video of the entire attack is on YouTube, including his camera equipment. But that's not it. They basically started tackling him and ended up dislocating his shoulder. One of the dragging him underneath the water extremely fast. Have any time to adjust to the depths of the water. This story has to be one of the worst